Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. Tina Davidson is the author of Let Your Heart Be Broken, a beautiful lyrical look back on her extraordinary and creative life. Tina is a highly regarded American composer who's been commissioned by well-known ensembles such as National Symphony Orchestra, Kronos Quartet, and many more. Today, Tina talks about her life and how it's influenced the evolution of her music. This is a conversation so full of wisdom, heart, and soul. Please welcome Tina Davidson to Bump in the Road. Tina, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Oh, thank you so much for having me, Pat. This is such a pleasure to be with you. So I am a composer out of a classical music tradition. I have been composing for about more than 45 years. It depends upon when you start to count it, when the pencil went first on the paper or when I first became sort of a freelance composer. So I always go from freelance. And then last year, I published a book called Let Your Heart Be Broken, Life and Music from a Classical Composer. And it is about my little strange life and also about my creative process, about composing and my absolute love of music and wanting everybody to be part of music. So that's where I'm coming from in my third act of life. I really have been sort of going back and not setting the record straight as much as really starting to have a more collected understanding of my life and what has happened to it. So, yeah.
Now, that's so interesting because I think that's actually a kind of a common experience as we get older into this third act, if you will. We're suddenly able to start seeing multiple perspectives of an event. You know, we experience it as a child. We can understand it slightly better as an adult. But how do you reconcile the two?
Right. I think that's always sort of maybe our life journey is understanding where we have been, what we've done, and sort of now what. And I think the idea of being a third act of life is such a great metaphor because Act 1 is sort of the setup, your origins, the beginning of the story. Act 2 probably is more like the conflict. What's going on? What's happening? And then Act 3, I think to some degree is about bringing those two acts together in some sort of resolution or understanding, or saying there is no understanding. So I do think that third act of going back and really thinking, feeling through your life and where you've been and what has been your process, for me, has been really interesting. And because I always write music about where I am in my life, this really seemed to be just the natural next step. So I've always composed about during difficult times, that I would sort of view an issue and try to bring it into my music. And music, by the way, is very anonymous. It's not like somebody is saying, oh, I see you have mommy issues. So that's what's nice about music is it has some anonymity and protection. But I've always used music not only to understand where I am, but also to get a feel for where I'm going.
How does it play into where you're going?
Well, there is this sort of, I have this kind of reciprocal relationship with my composing process, or my artistic process, if you want to say it that way. That as I pour myself into, hold on, I'm just going to turn this off. As I pour myself into my work, it in a funny way teaches me not only sort of a little bit more clearly about where I am, but suggests where I might be going. So in the first 10 years of my writing, I think I wrote sort of out of disconnection with myself. I really didn't understand myself very well. And then in the second act, or so, sort of in my 30s, I started to get down to brass nails and really started to look at what my traumas and discomforts were. And then I started writing music in connection to myself. In the third decade, interestingly enough, I think I had resolved those issues enough that my music was saying, hey, what about the great outside of you? You know, nature, the world, the cosmos, perhaps whatever you call God, the great spirit, God, the great presence. And so in the last 20 years, I've been very much writing about that spiritual relationship. And now, as I'm looking at my fifth decade of writing music, I think it's becoming more personal again, more tender, more, I don't know, maybe disconnected from the great big thing and bringing that down into myself.
What a fascinating evolution. Let's go back to Act One, because some of your early childhood experiences were really earth-shaking.
Yes, they were. And I write about it a lot in my book, Let Your Heart Be Broken. And I think, you know, the title, just as a little detour, the title is really about everyone has heartbreak. Everyone has their heart broken, and to allow that, to bring that into your life, not to bury it or hide it or avoid it. So my early trauma was that I was born in Sweden, and I was placed at 6 months old in a foster home in the southern part of Sweden, and I lived with that family for over 3 years. So I was the youngest. I was the little girl with 3 older brothers. The closest one in my one to me was actually almost my age, and we were brought up as twins, which I think is kind of important, that he was sort of my twin. And apparently I was definitely bossed him around. But one day a young professor from America came. She stayed in the area for a couple months, and then she adopted me and took me back to America. She married, and then I became the oldest of 5 children. And I always had a sense that even though I was completely integrated into the family, that I wasn't really part of it, that I had secret sort of concerns that, first of all, maybe my biological parents would come and want me back. Who knows? You know, if at 6 months you lose your mother and are put into a foster home, and then at 3.5 years, the same thing happens to you, life is pretty insecure. And I think those were unspoken traumas that really diminished my sense that the world was a safe place. And my mother was definitely not able to talk about it. And of course, it was the 50s, and mothers and fathers didn't really talk a lot to their children in those kinds of ways. But when I was 21, I happened to be back in Sweden, and I decided to go to the adoption agency and find out who my parents were. And I thought, you know, they were Swedes. I just made a lot of assumptions, you know, as children do. If you don't tell them stuff, they will assume probably the worst. So I went to the adoption agency, and she sat there in her office with a letter in her hand, and she said, well, I'm reading a letter from your birth mother. And then she said, well, your birth mother is your adopted mother. You were adopted by your birth mother. You have been living with your birth mother all along. So that was quite a surprise.
That's just stunning.
It is. And, we were talking a little bit before about identity. I had always wanted this relationship with somebody else's body. Like I came from that body. When my family talked about family stories, I always thought, oh, these are wonderful stories, but they are not my stories. They do not belong to me. And to know that not only that I had not been told this, but I had been living under this illusion of a word, and the word was adoption. I was not adopted in the way that one is adopted. I wasn't somebody else's child, but I had sort of constructed my life that way. And that thought that a one word could change everything was really scary and confusing. I had always suffered from depressions, but they became quite severe at that point. And it took me until I found out at 21, and I really didn't start therapy or working on it until I was like 30, 31, about 10 years later.
It takes time to assimilate something like that. I mean, I can only guess, but having these early years identified with a Swedish family and then moving into a totally different scenario, I mean, nothing makes sense.
Coupled with that was a piece that even I didn't understand, is that when I left my Swedish family, it was like my family died. My mother, my father, my brothers, my home, my country, my language. I only spoke Swedish up until that point. So I had also been carrying around this deep sense of loss. And I think that once I was able to really pinpoint that, I just started crying. And I think I wept for about 2 years about that. It was just this years of 30 years when I started therapy of having carried that loss and the loss of being identified as the daughter of my mother. And the loneliness that I felt during those years. It was a huge grieving process. And in fact, my book at one point was called Grief's Grace. So the grace that grief gives you if you allow yourself to grieve, that there is a certain grace that comes with that.
I interviewed a woman who wrote about adoption. And one of the things that she found among adopted children was a sense that something was missing, but it was a sense of identity in a very deep way. For example, we all have mannerisms. We usually pick up the mannerisms of our parents. We have stories, as you were talking about. Those are shared stories. This woman, Robin Hitt, found that the adoptees were lacking that, almost visceral, emotional, human connection with their original parent. And you went through not just that, but losing another family, becoming an outsider in what really was your family. I know I'm being a little repetitive here, but I can't get over this. I can't get over what a dislocation this had to be emotionally and practically in your life too. Not only how do you feel safe, but how do you connect with others for long-term relationships when you really haven't had that?
Well, I love that word dislocation because that is so apt and right on target. It's sort of like you were supposed to be a child in your family of origin or the family that you're living in and feel safe and protected. And in fact, I was located outside of the family in my mind and in my heart. And not only does that keep me from receiving anything that the gifts that were there, but it's such a, we do use this word trauma so much, but I think it's also an amputation. It's like you've lost part of you, and in a funny way, you do feel a lot of nerve pain, and then you look at your hand and you go, oh, but it's not there. And then to find out that actually it was there, that's really kind of shocking. And it took me years of therapy and work. I was holding my daughter and she was a newborn, and I thought, oh, wow, I can just sort of package this up and put a pretty bow on it and just hand it to my daughter, and it can be her legacy. Unfortunately, the truth is that as hard as one works on one's trauma, you're right, there is this sort of almost inability also to escape it. And that is a hard thing to deal with. As much as I protected my daughter from my trauma, there were ways that I also gave her some of that trauma. And it doesn't make me proud to say that. In fact, it doesn't at all. But I think that is also the reality. That I wasn't completely able to protect her from this. And I think that is part of the legacy that trauma, what does it say? A gift that keeps on giving?
It's so true, and it's intergenerational. I don't think any of us escape it.
No, I don't think so. I think I think that's easy to say. It's hard to live. It's hard to know that I have also caused trauma in my daughter in ways that I had no idea, that are, definitely connected to my trauma. But that's hardly an excuse,
But everybody's human. I think we all do the best we can at a point in time. Sometimes that's not too terrific. Sometimes it's pretty good.
Yes.
I think that's just the human journey.
Yes, it is. It is. I have a little harder time reconciling that for myself, inside myself. But it is absolutely true. So I really worked this problem and worked it and continue to work it. Even in the third act, things come up and I have to deal with them. Sometimes I'm like going, wait a minute. I've done this so many times. What do they say is that if you sort of solve a problem, it goes away, but it puts on different clothing and then gets back in line. I just love that image. That makes me laugh because it's so true. And if you have your wits about you, at the very best, you can say, oh, wait a minute, I recognize you. What are you doing? And then deal with it again. At worst, you invite this disguised person back into your house. And then as they're marauding about, destroying dishes, for instance, then you go, oh, wait, I know this.
I'd like to talk a little bit about your life as a composer. One of your professors, I believe, said, I'm going to quote from your book, courage. He sat rumpled in the chair, his right index finger raised. You must always dare to make a fool of yourself. And then you'll be able to do things you never dreamed you could do. He shrugged his shoulders. Yes. Learn to be embarrassed.
He said some wonderful things, and I felt so grateful that I had written them down because I could go back and refer to them again and again. And these are lessons that I don't think you learn once or even twice. You just have to constantly go back to them and learn them. And I was very fortunate that I was able to hear him say these things. That's the other fortunate part. He said them and I heard them and wrote them down. But I think, especially if you're in a field like the arts where you are sort of heaving your heart into your mouth, speaking the truth the best you know at that point, and then presenting it in a public forum where people receive it and they can either say thumbs up or thumbs down. You have to have not only courage, but a lot of padding, protection, because it is not a safe process. I think excuse me?
Oh, no, I'm just agreeing. It's not a safe process. And actually, I think the act of creation lies outside your comfort zone. And getting outside your comfort zone is never comfortable.
It's never comfortable. And, having done this many years, almost 50 years, I wouldn't say it's become more comfortable. I have more strategies, perhaps, but it is not more comfortable. But I do think in a parallel way, living life your fullest or speaking your truth or speaking truth to power or standing up for what you believe, articulating it is always takes courage and the willingness to not be accepted.
Yeah. And I think that act of putting yourself on the line and putting yourself out there, on the one hand, it's scary. On the other hand, as you do, do it more and more, I think you do develop kind of a bigger base of confidence. You've succeeded, you've failed, you've had those experiences. So whatever lies ahead, to some degree, you've already been there.
Absolutely. Although I have to say, when I start composing, it's sort of like the same kind of, it's just so boring. I'm like going, oh, I'll never be able to write this. I mean, it's just ridiculous. But at least I can go back and say, but this always happens to you. You always have a failure of confidence at this point. And just breathe, just keep on doing it, just have patience. And is the process easier? Well, I don't get the stomach ache I used to get, so that's easier. I probably don't nap as much either, so that's also easier. But
what are some of your
it's not
favorite
gone away.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Yeah, what are some of your favorite compositions?
Oh, well, I am just going back to some of the work that I did in 2005. And I wrote a series of pieces about earth, air, fire, water. But it was, I think his name is Epimedius. He goes by air, bright air, by air, bright air. So I wrote air, fire, and earth. I've just been going there for string orchestra, and I think they're really wonderful pieces. I'm really happy with them. In my recordings, I would say It Is My Heart Singing for string quartet and piano is a favorite piece. I just was in the studio and we're producing a CD album of works in the last 10 years. And there's one piece called Barefoot, which is about, it was really, I was up in Vermont and it was cold and snowy, and all I wanted to do is to go out in my bare feet and sort of touch the earth, be with the earth, feel it with the bottom of my feet. And then I was thinking about how Moses comes across the burning bush and he has to take off his shoes to be in the presence of God. And I love that idea of sort of bearing yourself, becoming unshod in the presence of greatness. So I was thinking about that while I was writing this piece called Barefoot.
talk a little bit about your opera project because I find that fascinating.
Oh, Billy and Zelda?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. So this was, first of all, I want to say I collaborated with two of my sisters, poet Eva Davidson and writer Lolly Davidson. And they're both younger than I am. Eva is 7 years younger and Lolly is about 11 years younger. And the story, Billy and Zelda, is about two children who have died, and they are both haunting their families because they want something. And you could say that it's a great parallel for me in my life, that I feel like I want something from my family that I didn't get when I was a child. So in Billy's case, and this was based on a friend of mine who was quite elderly, and her son had died in World War II as very young in life, like 20. And I always felt that he was haunting her, that she had grieved so many years that he really wanted to let him go. He needed him. He had things to do, and she was holding him to the earth. The other story, Zelda, which my sister Lolly wrote a short story for, was a story about my stepfather's youngest sister who had died as a child. And in her case, she was haunting her family because they didn't remember her. They had kind of put her away because they didn't want to deal with the grief. So both of these children, it alternates from one story to another story, like little chapters going back and forth, and then gradually they get closer and closer together. And all of these stories are sort of received by the main character who is pregnant with her first child. And she's trying to understand her relationship with this unborn child as she's hearing about these children ghosts who still have needs.
There was also an opera project, I think, with some, I want to say some women who were in difficult places. Is that right?
Oh, that project as well. Okay.
I found that really interesting, the idea of
yes.
reconstructing your story and singing your life.
Yes. I think I was a part of a project that was really rethinking how music was in social service organizations, how we could go out into the community and make music sort of a part of everybody's process. So this was in the early 90s, and this was quite a new idea. Before, music had just been in concert halls, and that's all. So I was coupled with an opera company, and that's where I wrote Billy and Zelda, and then with a symphony orchestra, and then with the YWCA. And I worked with homeless women who were in their residential facility. And these women had been homeless because of various difficulties in their lives, such as domestic abuse or addictions or loss of housing, any of the many things that happen. And some of them have lost their children. And there was a parenting skills class that they were required to take so that they could strengthen their relationship with their children. And I was part of that project. And so as a way of them thinking about themselves and their families and their children, I helped them write little operas of their lives. They of course had no musical background. So a lot of times they would sing these songs. I would record them and then they would all learn them. We had a script for the play, and then we had pots and pans. We were in the kitchen, so we used the pots and pans as a kind of drumming ensemble. But this was a way for them to find another way of thinking about their relationship with their children, put it in a different context, use a different part of their brain. To find meaning and strength in their relationships.
That's so interesting because I think that I think we all need to develop a flexibility of perspective, if you will, and learn to tell our stories in different ways. Because when we do that, we can start to realize it's only a story and you get to write it. What do you want to write?
Right. And you can change the ending or learn from it. And yes, absolutely. And then I did a lot of work in public schools where I'd go as a composer in residence, and usually in schools that didn't have a lot of resources, and teach composition to 5th and 6th graders, anybody who would sit still for me or not sit still. I don't mind if they don't sit still. But we did that through instrument building, and they would make instruments out of recycled objects. And then we went to graphic notation and invented notation, so they would draw and refine the symbols for the music that they wrote, and then we'd create a concert and play it for the school. And that was, I guess I got really excited about the innate creativity that anyone has. It doesn't matter that there's so much creativity, but a lot of times we don't name it, and we don't tell the children, this is yours, this belongs to you. Don't let anybody say that you don't have creativity. This is a resource for you. So I became very interested in teaching that kind of personal learning through music.
One of the themes that comes up in your book, too, is time. And I have a brief excerpt here where you talk about music and time. And you write, I am struck by music's linear process, where duration is the great ingredient. Unlike visual art, music cannot be experienced all at once. Instead, it moves through time. As we listen, we construct the whole in our mind through memory. Like a transparent ghost, music moves our hearts, and moves our hearts with its lack of tangible substance.
It is really interesting when you think about the art form. In the crudest form, music is sound. It's organized sound, silence, and duration. So the sound is just the medium. Silence is kind of the great backdrop. Sometimes there's punctuated silence in the music, and it certainly starts out of silence and ends in silence. And so it's a great backdrop. And duration is just how long it lasts, or even how long the notes are being held. Are the notes short? Are they long? But that it is this sort of invisible object that goes through time, and you can't be with the beginning and the end at the same time. Where with an art piece, you can definitely look at the whole thing at one time. And even a book, you can go back. There's a tangibility to it, so you can go back and look and find that part that you missed. But dance and music, even films, that really float in space in a funny way.
What a wonderful way to perceive it. So much of, I think, everyone's life journey is coming back on things, as you were talking about changing clothes and coming back to these events, both good and bad. Mm-hmm. And you wrote something that I just love. I think I'm going to pin it on my computer. You wrote, I need not to compose about sorrow or grief, but about my life, my history, my legacy. When I reveal myself, I speak for others. And then it goes on to say, what happened? I bumped into something and realized it was myself.
Right. Yes.
Thank you for listening. I hope you'll support this podcast by becoming a Bump 2 subscriber. Buy us a cup of coffee. It's your support that makes this podcast and website possible. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life.